What is it about intellectual property law that has changed in the last 20 or 30 years?
Well, one thing that's changed, I think, is that we've started to take it much more seriously than we have prior to the information age. For example, the United States decided finally in 1989 to sign the Berne Convention 100 years after it had initially been signed by most other countries in the world. The Berne Convention was the primary international document that protects copyright internationally. So, for example, copyright protection in the United States would have to be the same as it was in Britain. So you would protect works, foreign works, the same. The United States, of course, also didn't want to become part of any international regimes because early in our history we were some of the biggest pirates in the world. But once we hit 1989, the United States has shifted its position and is no longer an intellectual property pirate in the international sphere, but is instead an intellectual property producer. And so a lot of the U.S. economy is depending on intellectual property goods being exchanged abroad, and so there's now a concern for their protection outside of the United States. And so part of that shift in our position and our willingness to sign the Berne Convention at the end of the 80s has to do with our shift in terms of what our economic
self-interest.
Right,
yeah.
Right.
Can you give me some example of what those goods are, the intellectual property goods that America would want to defend?
Yeah. Well, Walt Disney, Mickey Mouse is an enormous and important economic product of the United States and has, of course, worldwide recognition. And so the entertainment industry also, CDs, movies, these things need or they desire to have international protection and are hugely pirated, of course, outside the United States. Technology also is another field where there is a desire on the part of American corporations to have protection for their property extended outside of U.S. borders. For example, Microsoft products are hugely pirated across the Asia-Pacific region, and so they, of course, have tried to develop mechanisms for counteracting piracy. And they do that through both the United States government, but also foreign governments and their own private organizations which fight for these issues abroad. For the most part, what's been happening is the centralization of the ownership of creative work. So while ideas technically can't be owned, right? Anyone can have an idea, and you can't own the idea. Once it's put into some form of expression, then you can own it. And the ownership of those expressions has been centralized even greater into the hands of larger corporate entities. And
so when you mean expression of an idea, you mean the product?
The product, the song, the technology, the written word, whatever it is. Yeah. So those things become owned, or the drug.
The example of Napster. I mean, one of the interesting things about that, I thought, was the extraordinary popularity. I mean, I can't remember the figures now, but it went from a standing start to one of the major institutions on the web, if you like. I mean, they were doing a tremendous business, which certainly indicates that an awful lot of people wanted that. And whatever the record companies thought about the situation, they were heading in a diametrically opposite direction.
Right, and the record industry as a whole had put little to no thought into how it would interact with the information age at all. And they were blindsided. They had no idea this was coming, or if they had, they just ignored it. And what's interesting is, and you don't hear about this a lot in the primary press, is that many artists have opted out of recording contracts and have moved over to, say, the MP3 site, where they could just distribute their work to the public directly.
And ignore the record.
Right. And so that is a powerful implication of the internet, is that you essentially disintermediate, right? You eliminate all those middlemen, and the creative artist can then connect directly to the public and make money, and at the same time facilitate a type of exchange that's far less exploitative of the artist and the consumer. The United States certainly has a huge piracy problem itself. Americans themselves aren't all standing behind this idea of intellectual property with one mind. There is a piracy problem in the United States. You can pretty much get any property, intellectual property you want, free here as well. It's so much easier to copy something now than it was 60 years ago or 50 years ago, because the digital medium makes it virtually impossible to keep a barrier between what you consider to be your creative work and those people that might want it. What's happening is an assertion of one ideology, and that's being countered by others. I really do, or I have
When you say ideology, what does that ideology represent?
That mean? Well, I've come to think of intellectual property as an ideology that is based on specific assumptions. And I mentioned one already, and that's the assumption that people only create if they have the possible incentive of making money or owning it. And these things are assertions. And certainly there are certainly examples out there that disprove it. Other aspects of the ideology have to do, I think, with who should own things. For example, the language itself suggests that this is all done to protect the author. But in reality, the author is very rarely protected. For example, I don't own the copyright to my book, which is an irony, I understand. The publishers own that. So copyright becomes a way of shifting ownership of ideas or ownership of the actual books into the hands of the publishers or the music industry or whichever huge conglomerate wants or has control. And the authors are not necessarily going to benefit. Now, certainly they get royalties, but at the same time they lose all rights to their creative work. So that's another component of it that is oftentimes not understood, because we all understand copyright to exist to protect authors, and that's not the case. It's there to protect the people who own the copyrights. There are people and corporations that desperately want to control and own the work that they do. So essentially what you see is this tension between the ownership of information and the free exchange of information. But what makes information so much different from a car or a chair is that you still own it after you've exchanged it. And so trying to figure out what the value of it is and how you can retain ownership becomes much more difficult. And that, again, is one of the things that's changed a lot in the last 20 or 30 years as information has become a commodity. And there are still very limited ways of trying to protect that information.